Hi everybody, welcome back to our lecture series related to pretty much all things communication and communication studies. Today specifically we are going to be discussing rhetoric, Aristotle's four uses of rhetoric, and the Aristotelian appeals. Depending on which course you're taking, whether it's public speaking, group discussion, argumentation, debate, organizational communication, these concepts can be woven into any one of those aspects. So when we think about, just from a broad perspective, the word rhetoric gets thrown around a lot, and typically in a somewhat negative or pejorative manner. So we're going to start out by talking about what rhetoric is and who came up with the different definitions, what are its roots, and it's a lot more complicated than we often make it. We'll then talk a little bit about Aristotle and what Aristotle thought about the four uses of rhetoric before getting into the Aristotelian appeals, which are ethos, pathos, and logos, which you may have heard of previously. So when we're thinking about rhetoric and we're thinking about what rhetoric is, what does it do, where does it come from, where did it originate, we often think about rhetoric stemming from Aristotle and ancient Greece, which makes a lot of sense simply because Aristotle wrote a book called Rhetoric, and we'll talk a little bit about that book here in just a minute. But I want to take this opportunity to think about rhetoric in a little bit of a more complex manner. And we're going to do that by using Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. And that definition is the artful use of language to shape the heart, the mind, or the will of some human or human enterprise. Now, looking at that definition, it's hard for me to think that this one person developed, created, invented rhetoric in this one part of the world in ancient Greece, in Athens. Simply because looking at that, right, we're thinking about the artful use of language. Okay, well, language is pretty widely used among all cultures, all human cultures, historically. Thinking about using language to shape the heart. Okay, so ceremonial speaking, ceremonies in general that use language to engage our pathos, engage our emotions. Well, it's probably been going on for a really long time. The mind, okay, we think about informative speaking. We're using language to teach, to share knowledge, to inform. As far as I know, human beings have been telling stories for a very, very long time. Last but not least, we have to shape the will of some human or human enterprise. Well, that's persuasion, probably a pretty strong case for that being used throughout all of human history. So when we're thinking about rhetoric, we often circle back and think about Aristotle as being widely considered the father of modern communication studies, the father of rhetoric. And I think it's important that we think about that from a more diverse perspective and understand that what we're doing in rhetoric and using language to achieve these different goals is not something that was invented by somebody or even really discovered by somebody. It's innate in the human experience. Humans have been engaging in rhetoric, in the artful use of language to shape the heart, the mind, or the will of some human or human enterprise. Humans have been doing that as long as human beings have existed. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, if that's the case, why do we think about Aristotle? Why are we talking about Aristotle today? Well, we're talking about Aristotle today because we have a lot of documentation, a lot of texts that circle back and reference rhetoric from an Aristotelian ancient Greek perspective. As we do more research, as we learn, naturally we're finding that there are people all over the world from all different cultures, backgrounds that were using rhetoric, that were studying rhetoric, that were talking about rhetoric. And we're starting to see that, well, while we have been thinking about Aristotle as being the starting point, that's not necessarily the truth. It's not wrong, but it's not right, somewhere in the middle. So we're talking about Aristotle because these are the important components for you to understand moving forward in your study of communication and Aristotle wrote these concepts down and gave us the text to build from. Specifically in that text, Rhetoric, Aristotle documents, observes, and analyzes public speaking with scientific rigor. And as far as we have seen up until this point, and will likely disprove this at some point in the future, but he was the first person to do this and to think about public speaking and oratory as something that could be studied just like you might study anything else scientifically. So to apply a particular theory, a concept, to think about it in a complex, structured, observable manner, Aristotle was one of the first people to do that. In this book, Aristotle also directly references a few things and proposes a few concepts, and this is part of why he's widely considered to be the father of modern communication studies. Whether you agree or disagree with that, it's a talking point in the field of communication. But he did develop what Aristotle felt were the four uses of rhetoric, which I think are really interesting and important to know as we move forward, and then also developed the rhetorical or Aristotelian appeals, and those are ethos, pathos, and logos. So these are going to be the things that we're going to be talking about today. So we'll start with Aristotle's four uses of rhetoric. Again, there's one perspective on a thing that is innate and very deep in the human existence, human experience. We're getting a perspective from that. And again, these are open to agreement and disagreement. They're flexible. So as we're working through this, take a moment here and there, pause, and think about it. Do you agree with Aristotle? Do you agree with me? What are your thoughts on developing and using the four uses of rhetoric? So according to Aristotle, the first use of rhetoric is that by it being rhetoric, truth and justice maintain their natural superiority. Now, I think this is a really interesting concept or idea because it hinges on the idea, number one, that truth and justice are tangible things that exist in the world. They have some kind of natural superiority. So not only are they tangible things that exist in the world, they have an innate superiority that puts them above all other natural things. I find this really interesting because as far as I know, truth and justice are concepts. They are human concepts that we have constructed through the use of language to create meaning, to share these ideas, to help society function in a particular manner. They're not things that you're going to find out in nature. You're not going to go on a hike and accidentally kick over a rock and find truth just sitting under that rock, right? It's not going to happen. So I think this is really interesting simply because it shows the value that Aristotle placed on those two concepts, and to the point where Aristotle believed that they were innate in nature and carried some kind of natural superiority. I don't necessarily agree, but I think it's really interesting to think about how we can value these things that don't necessarily exist in a tangible manner. The second use of rhetoric, according to Aristotle, is that rhetoric is suited to popular audiences since they can't follow scientific demonstration. This is really interesting to me simply because science can be challenging and scientific demonstrations can be really challenging because we have a step-by-step process that can be very difficult to follow. And if you pause and take a minute and think about your success in a lab, in a science lecture, following along some scientific demonstration, I think that you might be more inclined to agree with this one. I think that this is a fairly profound idea that Aristotle gave us, and that rhetoric, so the artful use of language to shape the heart, the mind, or the will of some human or human enterprise. I think it's really interesting to think about how rhetoric and that artful use of language is suited to a popular audience since they can't follow scientific demonstration. Just a quick side story here to kind of highlight this point, because I do tend to agree that most folks don't really look forward to following scientific demonstrations. And I'm not necessarily one of those. But one year for my birthday, my wife got me tickets to go see Neil deGrasse Tyson give a presentation on the search for life beyond the solar system. And it was really interesting because everybody thinks that's so odd that for my birthday I got tickets to go watch and see a lecture on astrophysics. That's not what most people would do, and I think that disinterest in scientific demonstration lends itself to this idea that Aristotle proposed to us so long ago. And then we have the third use of rhetoric according to Aristotle, and that is that it teaches us to see both sides of an issue and to refute unfair arguments. Now, this is a key component in why we teach, think about, and try to understand how rhetoric, how language is used to craft ideas, to get people to think, feel, or do particular things, because it's so important in how we interact on a daily basis. We have to think about it. And the key component to this aspect of it teaching us both sides of an issue is that in rhetoric, in the study of rhetoric, we have this thing called a balcony stance. And this is essentially an idea that we remove ourselves from a subject and look at it from above, from a balcony, literally. So if you think about at a sporting event, at a concert, at a theater, when you are more removed from that situation, from that thing, you can see more about what's going on. You can gain more information. And this is where that idea comes into play, is that you can see both sides, or in all honesty, most things have more than two sides, but you can see both sides or all sides of an issue because you're removed from it. You've removed your subjective thought, feeling about that thing, and you're thinking about it simply to observe, to analyze. So through the balcony stance, that allows us to say, hey, look, this is going on, and this is going on, and this is going on, and we like this, we don't like this, this is effective, this is ineffective, or this is ethical, this is unethical, and then we can therefore come to a conclusion or make a judgment about whether or not an argument is fair or unfair, and gain a deeper understanding of that argument, of what's going on in that particular communicative or rhetorical event. And then we get to Aristotle's fourth use of rhetoric, and that is that by understanding rhetoric, it acts as a means of self-defense. I think this is a very powerful idea. It's very simple in that understanding how somebody might, or an entity, person, an organization, how those things might use language to purposefully alter the way that we're thinking, feeling, or acting in relation to a subject, in relation to a thing. That is very important, because when we can identify those strategies, we can refute those things. We can say, hey, hold on a second. I see that you are trying to get me emotionally involved. You're trying to emotionally manipulate me. Therefore, I'm going to take an extra second to think about this thing a little bit more, because that red flag is waving in the back of my mind because it doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem right. I'm aware of your strategy. And that makes us better critical thinkers. And that's, of course, very important, especially in a college or academic environment. So Aristotle gave us these four uses of rhetoric. Number one, you believe that truth and justice maintain their natural superiority, and understanding rhetoric allows those things to maintain that natural superiority. Number two is that rhetoric is suited for popular audiences because they can't follow scientific demonstration. I don't know. I think it depends on your audience, of course, but I think this is a pretty strong idea that gives us a lot to think about. Number three is that through understanding rhetoric, we are able to see both sides of an issue and refute unfair arguments, and that comes through that balcony stance, that removal, purposeful removal of our subjective thoughts, feelings, and ideas about a thing. And then number four is that understanding rhetoric is a means of self-defense against rhetoric, against the use of language to shape the heart, the mind, or the will. So these four uses of rhetoric give us some really interesting ideas. They are really important for understanding how we can think about rhetoric and how we can build from these ideas and gain a deeper understanding of rhetoric and the field of rhetoric as a whole. Now, one of the things that Aristotle did in this analysis of rhetoric was develop the rhetorical or Aristotelian appeals that are used throughout all sorts of disciplines, and these are going to be ethos, pathos, and logos, and they're quite simple. So we'll start with ethos. Ethos are appeals to credibility. Now, this is really important because ethos is often linked or thought of as ethics. That's not wrong, but it's not right. So when we think about ethos, we want to think about appeals to credibility. And our ethics, our audience's perception of our ethics plays into that. If our audience or whoever is taking in that message, whoever we're communicating with, if they perceive us as being unethical, that is going to negatively impact our credibility. So it's super important that we're thinking about ethos as appeals to credibility, and there is an ethical component to that we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. There are two primary ways to think about ethos, and that's extrinsic and intrinsic. So we can think about extrinsic ethos is coming from outside of us, outside of an organization. It's our perception. So does our audience, again, our audience is whoever's taking in that message, taking in that communication, do they perceive us as being credible? Are we a trustworthy source? That comes from the overall perception that we have, and that's extrinsic. Intrinsic credibility comes from within. So it's how we, from a public speaking stance, how we present ourselves. How's our body language? How do we sound? But also, now if we're thinking about this from a variety of different perspectives in communication, it comes from within that organization, if you will. Does the organization think of itself as being credible? Do they know what they're doing? Do they take it seriously? And does that message, does that credibility find its way or infuse its way into its employees? That can be an aspect of intrinsic ethos. Then we have pathos. Pathos are appeals to emotion. So this is, again, really important because human beings, as we're emotional creatures, understanding emotion is very important, and being able to highlight and pick out those appeals to emotion is a key component to the understanding of rhetoric, in a sense that it makes us a more challenging, more critical audience for any kind of use of rhetoric. And then last but not least, we have logos, and this is appeals to logic or reasoning. So this is going to be our arguments of fact, our arguments of definition, our use of sources. This is going to be our stats, our data. This is going to be the information that we use to try and get our audience on board with what we're talking about. Maybe it's a good or a bad idea. We want our audience to think about that. And here's our research. Here's some information. So these things really are quite simple when we think about appeals to emotion, appeals to logic and reasoning. But I want to circle back and talk a little bit more about ethos and appeals to credibility, because you might be thinking, well, extrinsic and intrinsic, that doesn't really cover all of it. And it doesn't. And that's part of why we're going to talk a little bit more about it. So it's really interesting to think about credibility and what it is. And I like to think about it as essentially the believability or the trustworthiness of a communicator from an audience. So how much do we trust that source? And that, to me, that's the credibility. That's our ethos. It's how much do we trust that source. Now, a couple of things that I think are really interesting and some factors that relate to ethos and impact it are, number one, that it's receiver-based. So the receiver, the person taking in that message, they are the person who's determining whether or not a source is credible. So we have to be thinking about whether we're writing a speech, writing an argument, writing a presentation for board members. If we are on a PR team in an organization, we have to think about our audience and who's going to be taking that in and crafting that message so that our audience will hopefully perceive us as being credible, because ethos is determined by the receiver. Number two is that it is a multi-dimensional construct. So credibility is not just one thing, right? If you think about for yourself, what's a credible source to you for academic work or for your personal life? Who's a credible source? Well, it depends, and it's always changing, right? So you can have a credible source, somebody that you think is great, that you think is excellent, and you kind of hang on their every word, but then you find out something that damages their credibility, and maybe they're hypocritical, or they're saying something that they do when it turns out they're doing something different. It really varies. And so that credibility aspect, it's multidimensional, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing, and this is why we need to be thinking about it. Number 3 is that it varies on the situation and the context. So depending on where you are, you're going to have to think about credibility and the credibility of a source, credibility of yourself in different ways. So just for example, if I am teaching a course and I'm the professor for that course, I can hopefully assume that my students, my audience, will perceive me as being credible. I get a little extra credibility, and simply because I'm the professor of the course, and then I have to build from that, right? In a different context, I might go into a room full of other professors and I'm presenting, and they may not give me that same little bit of credibility simply because I'm the professor, because so is everybody else. So the context and the setting are going to impact how we think about credibility. And that's a good thing. It just adds an extra layer to think about what we're talking about. The last thing, we've already touched on this a little bit, is that our perceptions of credibility, our perceptions of ethos, they are dynamic. So we have to be thinking about, okay, appeals to credibility, they're complex, okay, they're receiver-based, they're multidimensional, they depend on the situation and the context, and they're dynamic, they're fluid, they're always changing. We want to be aware of that and be aware of our own credibility, our organizational credibility, the credibility of our source, the credibility of our argument based on the sources that we're using. We have to be constantly thinking about credibility. Now, one thing, again, just to circle all this all back to Aristotle again, is that Aristotle had some interesting ideas about credibility and about ethos. And Aristotle believed that the factors that determine credibility are good sense, good moral character, and good will. I think this is really interesting because all 3 of those things are value-based, right? Anybody in good sense, well, that's like saying common sense. So common sense varies depending on the situation, on the context, on the culture, on the language, when and where you are interacting. Common sense changes. It's dynamic, it's fluid. So to say good sense, it doesn't really give us a lot. Number 2 is to have a good moral character. Again, same thing, so flexible. Number 3, goodwill. Well, what is goodwill, huh? It depends on the audience. One person might see something and say, oh, they meant well by that. And another person might see something and say, oh, I can't believe they did that. How did they not see this? It's so detrimental, it's so problematic. So again, I think it's really interesting to think about ethos and the complexity of it, but then also add in those elements of this person who is well known for developing these ideas, building on these ideas, gave us 3 very flexible, very soft ways to think about ethos. All in all, that gets us to the end of our lecture today, or for this video. We covered a few things. Number 1 is that we want to think about rhetoric as being an artful use of language to shape the heart, the mind, or the will of some human or human enterprise, and to remember that even though Aristotle is widely credited with a lot of these ideas, if we look at this definition, we have to think about rhetoric as a human activity. It's something that human beings have been doing for all of human history. We talked about the 4 uses of rhetoric, and you can sum those up into thinking about that understanding the means of persuasion gives us a defense against those strategies. So if we understand how people, how organizations, how entities are trying to get us to think, act, or feel about something, we are a more critical thinker, we're a tougher audience member, we are going to be able to make better decisions. Number 3, we talked about the Aristotelian or rhetorical appeals. So ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos are appeals to credibility. Pathos appeals to emotion. Logos appeals to logic and reasoning. That concludes our lecture. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or any insights related to anything that we've addressed today. Take care, everybody.